The wind that blows across the northern oceans in winter is not like the wind most people know. It does not simply feel cold. It cuts. It bites through cloth, through wool, through skin. It creeps into bones and settles there like ice. And centuries ago, when ships were made of wood and sails were their only engines, sailors had to face that cold with almost nothing to protect them. No heated cabins, no modern navigation, no insulated clothing. Only the ship, the sea, and whatever strength they could find inside themselves. For sailors who crossed the frozen seas in those days, winter was not just a season. It was an enemy that never slept, an enemy that could slowly turn an entire ship into a drifting tomb of ice. And yet, men still sailed into those waters. Trade ships, fishing vessels, whalers, exploration expeditions, they all pushed north and west into seas that were known to swallow ships whole. Some of those crews returned with stories. Stories of frozen ropes that shattered like glass. Stories of waves turning into ice the moment they touched the deck. Stories of nights so cold that men woke up to find frost forming inside their beards. And sometimes, stories of ships that never returned at all. Because in the age of wooden ships, the greatest danger on the winter ocean was not always the storm. Sometimes the greatest danger was the cold itself. It would begin quietly. A ship might leave port in late autumn, when the air already carried the sharp smell of winter. The crew would know what was coming. Every sailor who had crossed the northern seas understood that once the cold truly arrived, life aboard a ship would change completely. Clothing was the first line of defense. But in those days, clothing was simple. Thick wool coats, heavy trousers, layer after layer of rough fabric. Sailors wrapped themselves in whatever they had. Wool, canvas, sometimes even old sailcloth. It helped, but the ocean wind had a way of finding every gap. It slipped through seams, crawled down collars, and wrapped around the body like invisible fingers. At sea, the cold always felt worse than it did on land. Because on land you could hide from it. You could find shelter. You could build a fire. On a ship in the middle of the ocean, there was nowhere to run. The deck was constantly wet. Waves crashed against the hull and sprayed freezing water across the boards. At first it only soaked the sailors' boots. But once winter truly arrived, something strange began to happen. The water didn't stay water for long. Within minutes it hardened. A thin sheet of ice formed across the deck. Every step became dangerous. Sailors had to move carefully, gripping ropes and railings as the ship rolled beneath them. And that ice never stopped growing. Each wave added another layer. Each gust of freezing wind hardened it further. Soon the entire ship began to change shape. The ropes stiffened first. Ropes that were normally flexible became rigid, frozen solid by layers of frost. When sailors tried to pull them, they sometimes cracked like dry branches. Then the sails began to freeze. Moisture trapped inside the canvas turned to ice, making the sails heavy and difficult to control. Sometimes entire sheets of ice formed along the edges, weighing them down. But the most dangerous change happened slowly, almost unnoticed. The ship itself began to grow heavier, because ice was forming everywhere, along the railings, across the masts, around the rigging, and especially on the deck. At first it was only a thin coating, but during long winter voyages, it could grow into thick layers, inches deep, sometimes even more. And that weight could become deadly, because when too much ice formed on one side of the ship, the balance changed. The vessel would begin to lean, just slightly at first, but every wave added more ice. Every gust of wind pushed the ship further, until the crew realized something terrifying. If they didn't remove the ice, the ship could capsize, even in calm seas. So in the middle of freezing storms, exhausted sailors were forced to climb onto the deck with axes and hammers. Hour after hour they hacked away at the ice, breaking it off the rails, smashing it from the rigging, chipping it away from the masts. The work was brutal. Their gloves froze stiff. Their hands went numb. Their breath turned into clouds that instantly crystallized in the air. But they couldn't stop, because the ocean did not forgive mistakes. And winter at sea was patient. It would wait. It would watch. And if a crew became too slow, too tired, too weak, the ice would take the ship. Sometimes the cold attacked the sailors themselves. Frostbite was one of the greatest dangers of winter voyages. A sailor might not notice it at first. His fingers would simply feel numb. Then the worst moments usually came during the night because darkness made the cold feel even deeper, and the men who sailed those old wooden ships often said that winter nights on the ocean felt endless, as if time itself had slowed down under the weight of the freezing wind and the silent black water stretching in every direction. And when the sun finally disappeared behind the gray horizon, the temperature would fall even further, and the deck that had already been dangerous during the day became a frozen trap where every step had to be careful, because one slip could mean a broken leg or a fall into the black freezing sea, and everyone on board knew that falling into that water in winter almost always meant death within minutes, because the shock of the cold alone could steal the breath from a man before he even had the chance to shout for help. And so the crew moved slowly across the ship, gripping ropes and rails, their boots scraping against the hard ice that had formed everywhere. Sometimes when the wind grew stronger, it carried tiny frozen droplets of seawater through the air that struck the sailors' faces like needles and stung their eyes until tears froze at the corners. And yet the work never stopped, because a ship at sea could not simply drift and wait for the weather to change. Sails had to be adjusted, ropes had to be secured, and the helm had to be watched every hour of the day and night. And this meant that the sailors were forced to leave whatever small warmth existed below deck and return again and again into the freezing wind, where their breath turned white in front of their faces. And sometimes the cold was so severe that even speaking became difficult, because the air burned the throat and lungs with every breath. And older sailors who had spent years crossing the northern oceans often warned new crew members about a strange danger that came with extreme cold, because the body sometimes stopped feeling the freezing entirely. And when that happened, it was far more dangerous than pain, because a man who no longer felt the cold could be slowly freezing without realizing it. And there were stories told quietly among crews of sailors who had sat down for just a moment during a long watch on deck, thinking they would rest only briefly, only to be found later stiff and silent, their bodies covered in frost, as if the sea itself had claimed them. And those stories were not told to frighten the younger sailors, but to remind them that winter on the ocean demanded constant attention, constant movement, and constant will to survive, because the moment a man allowed exhaustion to take control, the cold would begin to win. And exhaustion was another enemy that followed every winter voyage, because the work of breaking ice never truly ended. And during the harshest storms, the crew might spend hours chopping away thick frozen layers from the railings, the masts, the rigging, and even the sides of the hull, while waves crashed over the bow and instantly hardened into more ice, and the sound of metal axes striking frozen wood echoed through the wind like distant hammer blows. And sometimes the ship itself seemed to groan under the growing weight, because wooden vessels were never meant to carry tons of ice along their upper decks, and sailors knew that if the ice grew too heavy, the ship would begin to lean dangerously to one side. And once that happened, the situation could become desperate, because a ship that leaned too far could allow waves to crash across the deck, and each new wave would freeze, adding even more weight until the vessel might roll completely over and disappear beneath the dark winter water. And for that reason, captains often ordered their crews to fight the ice even during the most violent storms, because waiting until morning could be too late. And those nights were remembered long after the voyage ended, because men stood on frozen decks swinging axes in blinding snow, their faces wrapped in scarves, stiff with frost, their hands aching so badly they could barely hold their tools. And yet they kept working, because the survival of the ship depended on it. And below deck life was not much easier, because although the wind could not reach the sailors directly, the cold still found its way through the wooden planks of the hull, and the narrow sleeping quarters became damp caves of chilled air, where every blanket smelled of salt and wet wool. And many sailors slept in groups pressed close together, because shared body heat was often the only real warmth available. And sometimes a lantern burned low in the corner, casting weak yellow light across the beams of the ceiling, while the ship creaked and swayed above the dark water outside. And the men lay awake, listening to the sound of ice scraping along the hull, wondering if it was drifting past or slowly closing around them, because in the far north a ship could become trapped without warning when moving ice fields gathered during the night and crushed together by shifting currents. And if the crew woke to find their vessel surrounded by thick ice, the voyage could suddenly become something entirely different, because now the ocean itself had turned into a frozen prison, and escaping from that prison required patient strength and often a great deal of luck. and the sailors would climb onto the ice with long poles and axes, trying to break apart the frozen barrier piece by piece, pushing the ship forward a few feet at a time, while the freezing wind blew across the endless white surface, and sometimes the process took hours, sometimes days, and during that time food and water had to be carefully guarded because winter voyages already carried limited supplies, and fresh water was often made by melting ice over small cooking fires in the galley, which filled the cramped space with steam that quickly turned to frost along the walls. And yet, despite all of these dangers, the ships continued to sail year after year into the frozen seas, because trade demanded it, exploration demanded it, and the men who lived their lives on the ocean understood something that few people on land ever truly felt, which was that the sea did not belong to anyone, and it would never become easier simply because humans wished it to be, and so they learned to survive within its rules, wrapping themselves in thick wool layers, rubbing grease into their boots and gloves to keep out moisture, stamping their feet during long watches to keep blood moving through their frozen limbs, drinking hot broth whenever it could be prepared, and constantly watching one another for the pale gray signs of frostbite that meant someone needed warmth immediately, because the sea punished weakness quickly and there was rarely time for mistakes. And on the longest winter voyages, the cold sometimes lasted for weeks, without relief, the sky remaining a dull gray ceiling above the endless black water, while snow fell in slow, silent sheets, and the sailors moved like ghosts across the frozen deck, their beards white with frost, their shoulders bent against the wind, and through all of it the ship continued forward slowly, cutting through the freezing ocean, because stopping completely in winter waters could be even more dangerous than pushing ahead, and the men aboard knew that somewhere beyond that endless horizon warmer seas existed. But until they reached them, they were living inside a world made entirely of ice, wind, and determination, and many sailors later said that those winter voyages changed the way a man thought about survival, because on land warmth could always be found somewhere, but out there on the frozen ocean warmth had to be fought for every hour, and the men who returned from those journeys carried memories of nights when the cold felt like a living thing pressing against the ship from every direction, waiting patiently for the moment when the crew became too tired to fight it any longer. And those who survived understood that the true secret of sailors who crossed the frozen seas long before modern technology was not special equipment or powerful ships, but something far simpler and far harder, which was the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold, no matter how endless the winter night seemed. And sometimes the worst part of the winter voyage was not the storm or the ice, but the long silent days when nothing seemed to happen, and the ship moved slowly through gray water under a sky that looked just as cold as the sea below it, because those quiet days allowed the sailors too much time to think. And when men had too much time to think in the middle of a frozen ocean, their minds often wandered to dark places. They began to imagine what might happen if the wind suddenly stopped and the ship became trapped between drifting ice fields, or if the rigging froze completely and the sails could no longer move, or if the cold slowly weakened the crew until there were not enough strong hands left to keep the ship alive. And on those silent days, the sailors often watched the horizon carefully, because winter seas sometimes changed without warning. A calm gray surface could become a violent storm within hours, and every experienced sailor knew that winter storms were different from the storms of warmer months, because the cold turned every wave into a weapon as water crashed against the hull and instantly froze across the deck, forming new layers of ice that the crew would later have to fight. And sometimes during these storms, the ship itself began to sound different. The wooden hull groaned under the pressure of wind and water, while frozen ropes creaked like stiff branches high above the deck, and sailors standing watch could hear the ice cracking along the rigging whenever the wind shifted suddenly, and those sounds echoed through the dark like something alive moving through the ship. And the men who had sailed the northern oceans for years often said that a wooden vessel in winter felt almost like a living creature struggling to survive beside them, because every plank and beam reacted to the freezing cold. The wood tightened, the nails groaned, and the entire structure shuddered whenever a heavy wave struck the side. And yet the sailors trusted those ships, because despite Their fragile appearance wooden sailing vessels had carried men through some of the harshest waters on Earth for centuries, and their survival depended on constant attention, constant repair, and constant effort from the crew, because winter had a way of exposing every weakness in a ship. Even the smallest crack in the hull or tear in a sail could quickly grow into a serious danger once freezing wind and water began working against it. And so, sailors inspected the ship, endlessly checking ropes, tightening fittings, patching damaged canvas, and sealing gaps with tar whenever possible, because they understood that their wooden ship was the only barrier between them and the endless frozen sea surrounding them. And sometimes during especially long voyages, the crew began to lose track of time, because the days grew short in northern waters, and the sun often appeared only briefly above the horizon before fading again into gray twilight, and the nights stretched longer and longer until it felt as if darkness had swallowed half the world. And during those long nights, the lanterns below deck burned low, casting faint shadows across the beams, while sailors sat close together, warming their hands around cups of weak broth or tea, listening to the wind howl above them, and sharing quiet stories of other voyages, other winters, and other ships that had faced the same cold oceans long before them, because storytelling became another strange form of survival. On those journeys, it reminded the crew that they were not the first men to face such hardship, and that others had endured the same freezing winds and returned home again. And sometimes the older sailors spoke of the far northern expeditions where ships sailed even deeper into frozen waters, searching for new passages through the ice, and those stories were often darker, because the farther north a ship traveled, the more dangerous winter became. Entire vessels had vanished during those attempts, swallowed by drifting ice or crushed slowly between massive frozen plates, and the crews of those lost ships were never seen again, leaving behind only scattered rumors and half-written journals that described endless fields of white stretching across the ocean like another world where the sea itself had stopped moving. And even hearing those stories reminded the sailors how fortunate they were if their own ship still had open water around it, because once the sea truly froze solid, escape became nearly impossible. And yet, despite all of this fear, all of this danger, and all of this endless cold, sailors continued to make those winter journeys year after year, because the ocean had always demanded courage from those who crossed it, and the men who lived their lives at sea understood that survival depended not only on strength, but on routine, discipline, and stubborn determination. They learned to rise before dawn no matter how cold the air felt. They climbed onto the frozen deck and began the same work again, clearing ice, adjusting sails, checking ropes, watching the horizon, and guiding their ship through the gray winter water, mile after mile. And sometimes, after weeks of frozen winds and sleepless nights, something remarkable finally happened. The air slowly began to change. The sharp bite of the wind softened slightly. The waves no longer froze instantly against the hull, and the sailors could see a faint difference in the color of the sky ahead. And that change often meant the ship was leaving the coldest waters behind, moving slowly toward regions where winter still existed, but no longer ruled with the same brutal force. And those moments filled the crew with quiet relief, because surviving the frozen seas was never about conquering them, it was about enduring them long enough to sail beyond their reach. And every sailor who stepped onto a warmer deck after such a voyage understood that they had passed through one of the harshest tests the ocean could offer. And that knowledge stayed with them for the rest of their lives, because once a man had faced the silent frozen nights of the northern ocean and returned alive, he carried the memory of that cold forever, like a mark left by the sea itself. And yet, even when the ship finally began to leave the worst of the frozen waters behind, the memories of those weeks in the cold did not disappear easily, because every sailor aboard knew how close they had come to disaster during those long winter nights, and many of them would remember specific moments that stayed with them forever, moments when the wind became so violent that the masts seemed ready to snap, or when the ice had grown so thick along the railings that the ship leaned dangerously to one side, and the crew had rushed onto the frozen deck with axes in the middle of the night, swinging again and again at the hard white layers, while waves crashed over their boots and froze instantly around their legs. And sometimes those memories returned even years later, when the sailors were far from the frozen seas, sitting in warm taverns near busy harbors, telling younger men about what winter on the ocean truly felt like, because the stories of those voyages were not just tales of hardship, but Lessons passed from one generation of sailors to the next, warnings about what waited beyond the safety of the coast during the coldest months of the year, and many of those lessons were simple but vital, such as the importance of keeping the body moving, because stillness was the enemy in freezing weather. A man who stopped working for too long could feel the warmth slowly leaving his body until his fingers stiffened and his thoughts became slow and heavy, and older sailors watched carefully for those signs among the crew, because they knew that exhaustion and cold often worked together like silent partners, and if a sailor began to stumble or speak strangely, it could mean that the freezing air had already begun to take hold of him. And in those moments the crew acted quickly, forcing the man below deck, rubbing warmth back into his hands, giving him hot broth or tea, and sometimes placing him near the small iron stove in the galley where the weak heat felt like a blessing after hours spent in the wind. And although the stove was never strong enough to warm the entire ship, it still became the heart of life below deck during winter voyages, because sailors gathered around it whenever their watches ended, their stiff gloves drying slowly in the faint warmth, while steam rose from wet coats and boots, and the smell of salted meat or thin soup filled the cramped wooden space. And for a short time the crew could forget the endless ice outside the hull and speak quietly about home, about distant ports, about families they had not seen in months or sometimes years, because many sailors spent most of their lives moving from one voyage to another, chasing work across the oceans, and winter journeys were often the hardest of them all, yet they were also the ones that earned the greatest respect among experienced seamen, because surviving the frozen seas meant proving that a man had the endurance and discipline needed to face the worst conditions the ocean could offer, and captains often trusted sailors who had completed such voyages more than any others, because they knew those men would not panic when storms arrived or when the cold began to turn the deck into solid ice. And even during calmer moments on those journeys the crew remained cautious, because winter oceans held dangers that could appear without warning. Sometimes a strange grinding sound came from beneath the ship as drifting ice scraped along the hull, and sailors leaned over the rail trying to see shapes moving slowly through the dark water below. Sometimes small white chunks floated past like silent ghosts carried by distant currents, and other times the sea itself began to thicken with scattered ice that knocked softly against the sides of the vessel, reminding everyone that colder regions were still not far away. And when night returned, the sky above those northern waters sometimes revealed another strange sight that sailors rarely saw in warmer seas: the distant glow of northern lights stretching across the darkness in silent waves of green and pale blue light, and many crews stood quietly on the frozen deck watching that strange glow moving slowly across the sky like a curtain of cold fire. And for a moment even the harsh winter wind seemed less threatening beneath that silent display, and sailors who witnessed it often said that those lights felt like a reminder of how vast and mysterious the world beyond the ship truly was, because out there, surrounded by frozen water and endless sky, a small wooden vessel carrying a handful of men seemed almost insignificant against the power of nature itself. And yet those ships continued to sail, because humans have always been drawn toward the horizon, no matter how dangerous the journey might become. And the sailors who survived winter voyages across the frozen seas understood something deeply important about endurance. They learned that survival was not about defeating the ocean or conquering the cold, because those things were impossible. The sea was too vast and winter too powerful. Instead, survival came from patience, from discipline, and from the quiet determination to continue working even when every part of the body ached and every breath burned with freezing air. And when the voyage finally ended and the ship reached a harbor where the water no longer carried drifting ice and the wind no longer cut like a blade, the crew stepped onto solid ground with a kind of silent pride, because they knew that they had faced one of the harshest environments on Earth, using nothing more than wooden ships, simple tools, and their own stubborn will to survive. And the stories they carried from those journeys would travel with them for the rest of their lives, told again and again in ports across the world as reminders of a time when sailors crossed the frozen seas long before modern technology guided their way, and when survival depended entirely on the strength of the crew and the fragile wooden ship beneath their feet, pushing slowly through the endless winter ocean. And as the voyage continued, the sailors slowly realized something that every experienced seaman eventually learned during long journeys through the northern oceans. The cold was not just an enemy outside the ship, it slowly crept into the mind as well. Because week after week of gray skies, frozen wind, and endless dark water began to change the way a man looked at the world. The horizon always seemed distant, the nights always seemed longer than they should be, and sometimes during the quiet watches, when only the sound of the sea touched the hull, sailors began to feel a strange isolation, as if the rest of the world had disappeared far beyond the cold horizon, and the small wooden ship, drifting through the winter ocean, had become the only place where life still existed. And during those silent hours, the crew stood alone beside the wheel or along the rail, their lantern casting a weak yellow circle across the frozen deck, while beyond that circle, there was nothing but darkness, wind, and the deep, slow movement of the sea. And it was during moments like these that sailors sometimes noticed strange things, shapes in the distance that might have been drifting ice, or shadows moving across the water, sounds carried across the wind that could have been the creaking of distant ice fields or the distant call of seabirds lost in the storm. And although most sailors trusted their experience and ignored such thoughts, the truth was that winter oceans had always been surrounded by strange stories, whispered in harbors and passed quietly between crews. Because when men spend enough time in a place as vast and silent as the frozen sea, their imagination sometimes filled the empty spaces with things that might not truly exist. And yet, even the most practical captains admitted that the northern oceans had a way of producing moments that were difficult to explain. For example, there were nights when the fog rolled across the water so thick that the ship seemed to sail inside a gray wall, where even the bow vanished from sight, and the sailors could hear nothing but the slow slap of water against the hull and the distant groan of ice somewhere beyond the fog. And in those moments, every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed closer, and every sailor listened carefully for the warning cry of the lookout, because a single hidden iceberg appearing suddenly through the mist could tear open a wooden hull in seconds and end the voyage before anyone had time to react. And so the crew remained alert, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on their shoulders, because surviving the frozen seas demanded constant awareness. Every sailor knew that danger could appear without warning. And sometimes the most frightening part of winter sailing was not the storms or the ice, but the long, uncertain silence between them. Because during that silence, the ocean seemed to be waiting, watching the fragile ship moving slowly across its surface and testing the patience of the men aboard. And yet, despite all of that tension, something remarkable often happened to the sailors who endured these voyages together, because hardship created a bond that few people on land could truly understand. Men who spent weeks battling frozen winds, breaking ice from the rigging, and sharing the last warmth of the galley stove began to trust each other completely. Every sailor depended on the strength and discipline of the others, because one mistake, one careless moment during a storm or while working on the icy deck could place the entire ship in danger. And so the crew moved like parts of a single machine, each man knowing his role, each watch passing responsibility to the next, while the ship continued forward through the frozen world around them. And slowly, day after day, mile after mile, the sea itself began to change. The water grew darker and more open, the wind carried less of the sharp, icy bite that had ruled the northern waters, and the sailors noticed that the ice floating past the hull became smaller and more scattered, until eventually entire days passed without seeing any at all. And when that happened, a quiet feeling spread across the crew, because they understood that they had crossed the worst of the frozen ocean and survived. And although the voyage was not yet finished, the danger that had followed them for weeks was finally beginning to loosen its grip. And some sailors even removed the heavy scars that had covered their faces for so long, letting the softer air touch their skin, while the ship sailed onward beneath a sky that no longer looked like endless winter, but like the beginning of distant, warmer seas. And in those moments, the crew often stood together along the rail, watching the horizon in silence, because every man aboard understood what they had just endured: weeks of cold that froze ropes and sails, nights where sleep came only in short, restless moments, days spent chopping ice from the deck while storms roared around them. And through all of it, the ship had continued moving forward, guided only by the skill of the crew, the strength of the wooden hull, and the stubborn determination that had always defined sailors throughout history, and even though the frozen seas were now slowly disappearing behind them, none of the men aboard would ever forget what they had experienced there. Because once someone had crossed those cold, silent waters in the age before modern engines, before heated cabins, before powerful steel ships, they carried that memory, forever the memory of a time when survival depended on teamwork, discipline, courage, and the fragile wooden vessel pushing slowly through a world of ice, wind, and endless winter ocean. And even after the worst of the frozen ocean slowly disappeared behind the ship, the habits learned during those brutal weeks did not vanish from the crew, because once a sailor had spent enough time in the grip of winter seas, his body almost refused to relax completely. And even when the air grew softer and the waves rolled more gently, the men still moved across the deck with the same careful steps they had used when everything was covered in ice. They still checked the ropes again and again. They still watched the horizon closely and listened to the wind, as if at any moment the freezing storm might return and trap them once more inside that silent white world. And sometimes during the evening watch, when the sky finally cleared after weeks of gray clouds, the sailors looked upward and saw stars shining brightly across the open sky, something many of them had not seen clearly since the voyage had entered the cold northern waters, because storms and snow had hidden the heavens for so long. And those quiet nights under the stars brought a strange calm to the ship. The wind whispered softly through the rigging, the waves moved slowly against the hull, and the lantern near the helm swayed gently as the ship continued forward. And in those calmer hours, the sailors often spoke about the long weeks they had just survived. They remembered the worst storms, the nights spent chopping ice from the deck, the frozen ropes that cut into their hands, and the moments when the cold had been so intense that breathing itself felt like swallowing knives. And sometimes the younger sailors listened silently as the older men described earlier voyages when ships had not been so fortunate, when entire crews had disappeared in the northern seas, leaving only broken wreckage found months later along distant coasts. Because winter on the ocean had always been unforgiving, and even the strongest sailors understood that survival often depended as much on luck as on skill and strength, and that truth created a quiet respect among the crew for the fragile wooden ship that had carried them safely through the frozen waters, because every plank of that vessel had endured the same freezing wind, the same crashing waves, and the same crushing weight of ice that had tested the endurance of the men aboard. And yet the ship had held together, pushing forward mile after mile through darkness and storm, as if it too understood that stopping meant death in the winter ocean. And sometimes sailors even joked quietly that their ship had its own stubborn spirit, refusing to surrender to the cold just as fiercely as the crew themselves. And as the voyage continued southward, small signs of change slowly appeared. Seabirds returned first, distant white shapes circling above the waves, their sharp cries echoing across the open water. And for many sailors that sound was more comforting than anything else, because birds meant life nearby. They meant land was not impossibly far away, and they meant the frozen silence of the northern ocean was finally loosening its grip. And then the color of the sea itself began to shift from the dark steel gray of winter waters to a deeper moving blue that reflected the sky above it. And the sailors who noticed this change sometimes smiled quietly, because they knew that warmer currents were beginning to touch the ship's path, and each day the wind carried a little less of the sharp icy sting that had once frozen their faces during every watch. And although the voyage was still long and the ocean still vast, the crew now moved with a new sense of confidence, because they had already faced the harshest trial the sea could offer and survived it. And every sailor understood that once a crew had endured a frozen voyage together, there was very little else on the ocean that could truly frighten them anymore, because they had already experienced the worst: the endless nights, the frozen decks, the crushing storms, and the silent white horizon where the sea and sky seemed to merge into one cold, empty world. And now, as the ship sailed steadily toward distant ports and warmer waters, the men aboard carried something invisible but powerful with them: the knowledge that long before engines, steel hulls, or heated cabins existed, sailors had crossed these same brutal oceans using nothing but wind wooden ships and their own determination. And the crew standing on that deck now were part of that long, unbroken tradition of survival on the sea, a tradition written not in books, but in frost-covered ropes, storm-torn sails, and the memories of men who refused to surrender even when winter itself seemed determined to swallow their ship forever. And although the sea was slowly becoming calmer, the crew knew that winter voyages had a strange way of delivering one final challenge before releasing a ship completely from its grip, because the ocean was unpredictable, and even after weeks of survival, a single careless moment could still bring disaster. And so the sailors continued their watches with the same discipline that had carried them through the frozen waters before dawn. Each day the lookout climbed to his position high in the rigging, scanning the horizon through the cold wind, while the rest of the crew prepared the sails, checked the ropes, and listened carefully to the voice of the captain guiding the vessel forward across the endless moving water. And sometimes in the quiet hours before sunrise, the ocean became strangely peaceful. The waves rolled slowly beneath the hull. The sky above remained dark and full of stars, and the only sound was the steady creak of the wooden ship moving through the water. And during those moments, sailors often felt something difficult to explain, a mixture of relief, pride, and deep exhaustion, because their bodies still remembered the freezing storms, the nights spent hammering ice from the deck, and the endless wind that had once filled the air with needles of frozen spray. And now, as the ship sailed farther away from those brutal regions, the men aboard began to realize how close they had truly been to the limits of human endurance during those weeks in the frozen seas. And yet, despite the danger, despite the hunger, the sleepless nights, and the constant battle against the cold, none of them had abandoned their duties. Not a single watch had been missed, not a single storm had broken the discipline of the crew, because sailors understood something that people far from the ocean rarely realized: survival at sea was never the responsibility of one man alone. It was the result of every sailor working together, every rope tightened at the right moment, every sail adjusted during the storm, every warning shouted across the deck when danger appeared. And that shared responsibility created a silent respect among the crew, stronger than words, because each man knew that the others had faced the same freezing wind, the same fear, and the same exhaustion, and still continued working beside him. And as the voyage moved onward, small signs of the wider world slowly returned. Ships began to appear again on the distant horizon, thin dark silhouettes moving across the water under tall sails. And whenever one of those vessels passed close enough, both crews sometimes raised their hands in silent greeting, because sailors everywhere recognized the meaning of a winter voyage. Any ship that had recently emerged from the frozen northern seas carried a story of survival written into every scar across its hull and every exhausted face along its deck. And eventually the smell of land began to reach the ship, faint at first, carried by the wind, a mixture of earth, distant forests, and smoke from unseen settlements far beyond the horizon. And that scent often filled sailors with quiet excitement, because after so many weeks surrounded by nothing but water, ice, and sky, the thought of solid ground felt almost unreal. And some men leaned over the rail looking ahead, as if the coastline might suddenly appear rising from the ocean at any moment. And although the journey was not finished yet, the crew already knew that they had succeeded. They had crossed the frozen seas using only wind, wooden sails, and their own determination, just as countless sailors had done for centuries before the age of engines, satellites, and heated steel ships. And that knowledge carried a powerful meaning, because it reminded them that human survival in the harshest places on Earth had always depended not on comfort or technology, but on courage, discipline, and the quiet, stubborn will to keep moving forward even when the cold wind howled across the deck and the horizon showed nothing but endless winter ocean stretching beyond the edge of the world. And as the coastline slowly grew closer, the sailors began to notice subtle changes in the air. The wind no longer carried the sharp sting of ice, and the waves moved with a softer rhythm against the hull. Yet even as these signs of approaching land gave them hope, the crew remained vigilant, because months spent at sea in winter had taught them that relief could be fleeting, and that the ocean often saved its most unexpected dangers for the last moments of a voyage. Storms could appear suddenly, currents could shift, and ice could still drift from hidden northern patches. And so the men continued to check the rigging, inspect the ropes, and adjust the sails, even when the horizon showed nothing but gentle waves and the first signs of vegetation on distant cliffs. And as the ship moved closer to the coast, gulls began to appear, their high cries echoing over the water, and sailors would watch them carefully, because the birds often indicated shallow water approaching and nearby land, which meant The voyage was entering its final stage, and yet the relief among the crew was tempered by exhaustion, for weeks of continuous struggle against freezing wind and ice had left the men with bodies stiff and sore, their hands permanently marked by frostbite, their faces weathered by endless exposure, and their spirits tempered by constant vigilance. And sometimes in these final hours the sailors reflected quietly on what they had endured. They remembered nights when the deck had become a treacherous sheet of ice, the hours spent chopping frozen layers from rails and rigging, the constant damp chill that penetrated every layer of clothing, and the long silent days when the endless gray sea stretched before them like a frozen void. And they understood that survival in those northern waters had not been about glory or fame, but about something deeper, the unspoken understanding that each man's life depended on the other's, the fragile wooden ship beneath their feet, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold no matter how long it pressed against them. And when at last the ship glided into calmer waters where the waves were gentle and the air carried the warmth of approaching spring, the sailors allowed themselves a quiet moment of reflection and gratitude. They knew they had faced one of the harshest environments on the planet, using nothing but wind, wood, and their own endurance, and that knowledge became a part of them, a permanent mark that would remain long after they had returned to ports filled with bustling life and warmth. And as they finally dropped anchor near the shore, the crew stepped onto solid ground, stretching stiff limbs, inhaling the air that no longer cut like a blade, and looked back at the open sea with a mixture of awe and respect, because the frozen northern oceans had tested them to their limits, and yet they had survived, carrying forward the ancient legacy of sailors who had braved the cold long before engines, steel hulls, or heated cabins existed, proving that courage, discipline, and unwavering determination could conquer even the most merciless winter seas. Even as their boots sank into the solid ground, the men did not forget the frozen seas they had just left behind. Weeks of endless wind, ice-laden decks, and nights where the cold had crept into their bones had forged a bond among the crew that no land, no tavern, no warm hearth could ever break. They moved quietly, each man lost in memory, remembering the nights when the wind shrieked like a living thing across the masts, when frost crept silently across the deck and into their clothes, when a single slip on the ice could have ended everything. The younger sailors looked to the veterans, eyes wide with awe and a hint of fear, knowing they had survived something far beyond ordinary human experience. The older men, their faces etched with years of cold and toil, spoke little, but their silence carried weight. It was the language of understanding forged in extremes, of knowing that survival was measured in moments, one decision at a time, against a force far larger and older than themselves. They began unloading cargo, not with cheer, but with a sober efficiency born from months of discipline. Every rope, every sail, every tool had been tested by the freezing waters, and the men treated them with respect, aware that each object had been part of their survival. Even the ship itself seemed to exhale as it settled into calmer waters, its wooden planks carrying the scars of frost and storm like a veteran of countless battles. As the sun finally rose above the horizon, spilling light across the harbor, the sailors noticed how differently they viewed the world. The air felt almost soft against their faces, and the gentle lap of the waves against the shore seemed almost alien after the harsh rhythm of the northern seas. The frozen wind and the endless ice had taught them patience, resilience, and the value of every small victory. A rope untangled, a sail mended, a fire kept alive. In the days that followed, as the crew rested and the ship was repaired for future journeys, stories began to emerge. Quiet conversations in the galley recalled nights when frostbite had crept unseen, when ice threatened to overturn the vessel, when the cold seemed alive, pushing back against every effort. Tales of endurance became lessons, shared with younger sailors who had joined the voyage, ensuring that the knowledge of surviving the frozen seas would continue long after their return. Even years later, the memory of those weeks would not fade. In taverns across northern ports, sailors would speak of the frozen seas, of ice that could crush a ship, of wind that burned through clothing, and of nights so dark that the stars themselves seemed to vanish. Each story carried the weight of experience and respect for the relentless ocean, reminding all who heard it that the sea was not conquered, only endured. And so the ship, the crew, and the frozen northern waters became part of each other's history. Every man who had faced the cold carried its lessons, its hardships, and its silent victories into every voyage thereafter. The frozen seas had tested them, shaped them, and survived within them long after they had set foot on warm land again. If you want, I can continue expanding the story even further, adding more dramatic encounters, personal sailor moments, near-death experiences, and the vivid details of surviving the final stretch of winter before reaching warmer waters, to make it fully immersive for a 60-plus minute video. As the ship finally settled into the calm harbor, the crew stepped onto solid ground with a mixture of relief and awe. Months of frozen nights, ice-covered decks, and relentless wind had forged them into a single unit, each man carrying scars, both visible and invisible, from the harsh northern seas. The young sailors who had boarded uncertain and fearful now stood taller, having learned the true meaning of endurance and teamwork. The veteran sailors, weathered by countless winters, looked on quietly, knowing that every man on this voyage had faced the ocean's fiercest trials and survived. The wooden ship, battered and scarred by frost and storm, had proven its resilience, carrying its crew safely through a world of ice, darkness, and wind. As the sun rose over the harbor, spilling warmth across the harbor, the men reflected on what they had endured. They had faced the frozen seas without modern technology, relying only on skill, determination, and one another. The lessons of patience, vigilance, and courage would remain with them for the rest of their lives, engraved into their memories as deeply as the frost had etched itself into their clothing and skin. And though the cold northern ocean lay behind them, its presence lingered in every man, a silent reminder of nature's power and of humanity's ability to endure against the harshest of odds. The frozen seas had tested them, shaped them, and survived within them, and in that shared victory, the crew understood something timeless, that courage, unity, and unwavering will could carry them through even the most merciless winters, leaving them forever bound to the endless, unforgiving ocean they had conquered together.